The most disturbing crime in Boulder? New clues that everyone ignored in JonBenét's last 24 hours. Viewer discretion. Warning. This documentary contains real events, sensitive details, and descriptions that may be disturbing to some viewers. Please watch responsibly. It began on a night when the entire town of Boulder believed the world outside was calm, untouched, safe. A night wrapped in the soft glow of Christmas lights. A night that should have ended with nothing more than the quiet rustle of winter wind, moving through perfectly aligned suburban streets. But inside one home, behind polished windows and layers of holiday warmth, something else was happening. Something dark. Something that would fracture Boulder's sense of innocence forever. Because within a span of just 24 hours, a single day wrapped in celebration, routine, and family rituals, a secret was forming. One that no one in that quiet Colorado neighborhood dared to imagine. A secret that would explode into headlines, ignite theories, divide the nation, and leave behind a mystery so powerful that, nearly 3 decades later, it still refuses to fade. This is the final day of JonBenét Ramsey. The day everyone thought they understood, but what no one knew was, important clues were already there, hidden, ignored, overlooked in the comfort of a town that believed terrible things only happened far away. Before we dive in, but before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. There are many stories buried beneath America's quiet towns, and this is one of the darkest. Boulder, Colorado in 1996 was the kind of place people moved to for peace. Tree-lined sidewalks, well-funded schools, a reputation for safety so strong that residents often left their doors unlocked without a second thought. It was a prosperous community, educated, calm, predictable, a bubble of privilege surrounded by the natural beauty of the Rockies. Snow softened the rooftops that December. Christmas decorations lit up the historic Pearl Street district, and families, especially families like the Ramseys, embraced every tradition the season promised. On the surface, the Ramseys were living the American dream. John Ramsey, a successful businessman with a growing tech company. Patsy Ramsey, a charismatic former beauty queen known for her social presence and devotion to her children. Burke, a quiet 9-year-old with a reserved personality. And JonBenét, 6 years old, vibrant, charming, and widely recognized for her participation in local beauty pageants. To Boulder, they seemed untouchable, respected, admired, a picture-perfect portrait placed neatly within the frame of suburban success. But beneath that polished image, subtle complexities were forming. Small-town gossip whispered about the pressures of child pageants. Neighbors wondered about Patsy's emotional ups and downs. Others noticed how the family sometimes seemed close, but distant, united, yet strangely guarded. These impressions weren't evidence of anything sinister, but they would later become threads in a web that investigators struggled to untangle. And then there was the house. Large, elegant, a maze of rooms and hiding places. A structure so complex that even seasoned detectives later admitted it was easy to get lost inside. A house perfectly capable of concealing secrets, even from the people who lived in it. But the true shift, the rupture that made the unthinkable possible, happened slowly in the final days before Christmas. A change in routine so small that no one fully recognized its importance at the time. Friends noticed Patsy seemed unusually tense that week. Exhausted, almost scattered. John appeared preoccupied, juggling business responsibilities even during the holiday break. And JonBenét herself, vibrant as ever, showed signs of fatigue during the last family gathering. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just the kind of subtle changes that small towns dismiss as normal holiday stress. Yet, in hindsight, these behaviors would become critical pieces in a timeline investigators would later describe as fractured, inconsistent, and filled with overlooked opportunities. Because while Boulder slept that night, wrapped in snowfall and comfort, a storm was already brewing inside the Ramsey residence. A storm that would not fully reveal itself until the next morning, when everything would change. When a 911 call would shatter the silence, and when the world would learn that the most disturbing crime in Boulder's history had already begun. But what unfolded next would challenge every assumption investigators held about this family, this town, and this final day that no one examined closely enough. As Christmas Day faded into the early hours of December 26th, the Ramsey home appeared like any other festive house in Boulder. Warm lights, wrapping paper in corners, the remains of holiday cheer still scattered across the living room. But beneath that quiet glow, something far more complicated was unfolding. The Ramsey family had spent the previous day moving between gatherings, friends' homes, and church events. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but when investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they noticed small inconsistencies, details that didn't line up cleanly, moments where the routine shifted just enough to create openings, opportunities, spaces where danger could slip in unnoticed. JonBenét's last 24 hours were busy, filled with the typical excitement of a child during Christmas. She visited friends, opened gifts, laughed with relatives. Yet multiple people reported that she seemed unusually tired that afternoon, quieter, clingier, less energetic. Some chalked it up to the holiday rush. Others would later admit it felt strange. Inside the Ramsey house, tension had been quietly building. Patsy, always the image of control, was described as overwhelmed in the days leading up to Christmas. One neighbor remembered something specific, how Patsy's voice trembled slightly during a casual conversation, as if she were holding back stress that wasn't entirely about the holiday season. John, on the other hand, appeared distant that week, polite, but absent, his mind elsewhere, preoccupied with work obligations despite being home for the holiday. A few close acquaintances described him as unusually quiet, even for his reserved personality. Small-town dynamics magnified these impressions. In Boulder, people noticed every slight change, every shift in tone, every unusual gesture, but they rarely questioned them openly, not in a community where reputations mattered more than confrontations. During that final evening, the family returned home after a Christmas gathering with friends. What happened after they stepped through that front door has been reconstructed and debated for decades. Who was awake? Who went to bed when? Who heard what? And who didn't? Patsy claimed she put JonBenet to bed almost immediately. A simple moment, nothing remarkable, except investigators would later question whether JonBenet truly went straight to sleep, or whether something else occurred before the household quieted. Several neighbors reported seeing lights on in the Ramsey home later than usual. Another claimed they heard a strange metallic sound around midnight, something that didn't match the calm of a sleeping house. None of these details were taken seriously at the time. Not by the police, not by the media, not even by the residents who reported them. After all, who wants to believe that darkness is forming right behind the windows of a wealthy, admired local family? Inside the home, investigators found signs that the night wasn't as peaceful as initially claimed. A bowl of fruit left out, a flashlight placed neatly in the kitchen, a detail that would later spark countless theories. A window in the basement with a broken grate, though its role in the case remains disputed even now. And the ransom note, a document so bizarre, so elaborate, and so deeply suspicious that it remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in American criminal history. But we're not there yet, because the rupture, the break-in routine that made the crime possible, likely began much earlier, in subtle gestures, in tense exchanges, in a household where pressure, secrets, and unspoken frustrations simmered beneath the polished surface. Some friends recalled hushed arguments in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Others noticed the family was off, though none could clearly articulate why. One neighbor reported seeing JonBenet outside briefly that afternoon, alone, looking thoughtful, almost as if something was weighing on her mind. And though this single observation may seem small, it would later fuel a dozen theories about her emotional state that day. What the town didn't discuss, at least not publicly, was how strained relationships behind closed doors could become during the holidays, how expectations, image, and perfection sometimes collided with exhaustion and unspoken fears, and how, in small towns like Boulder, people often chose silence over confrontation, afraid to disrupt the illusion of harmony. But that illusion shattered in an instant, because in the early hours of December 26th, something happened inside that house, something violent, sudden, and irreversible, something that none of the Ramseys would ever fully explain in a way that satisfied detectives or the public. The house wasn't as still as the family later suggested. Movements occurred, footsteps, events that couldn't be neatly aligned with any single version of the story. And when morning approached, wrapped in winter quiet, something unspeakable had already taken place. But Boulder didn't know that yet. Not the neighbors, not the police, not even the Ramseys' closest friends. It would all begin with one panicked call, a voice trembling, a mother insisting her daughter was gone, and a note, so strange, so theatrical, that investigators would spend years trying to understand who wrote it and why. But once officers stepped inside the Ramsey home, the situation became even more unsettling, and the first major mistakes of the investigation were about to unfold. The morning of December 26th should have been quiet, the kind of lazy winter morning where families recover from Christmas celebrations, sipping leftover cocoa while children play with new toys. But at 5:52 a.m., the Boulder Police Department received a 911 call that shattered that calm forever. Patsy Ramsey's voice broke through the static, high-pitched, panicked, almost frantic in a way that investigators later described as dramatic, but oddly controlled between breaths. Her words came fast, stumbling, overlapping, drenched in terror. "My daughter is gone. There's a note. She's been kidnapped." The dispatcher tried to guide her, but Patsy talked over instructions, repeating fragments of the situation. Behind her, faint sounds seemed to leak into the recording, unintelligible noises that would later fuel endless debate. Some believed they heard a child's voice. Others believed they heard murmuring, as if multiple people were in the room with her. Yet even before investigators arrived, something else struck the dispatcher as deeply strange. The call ended abruptly, too abruptly. Most parents in genuine panic stay on the line, clinging to any voice offering direction. But Patsy hung up quickly, a detail noted, reported, and ultimately ignored in the chaotic hours that followed. When officers arrived, the Ramsey home was not the crime scene they expected. Typically, families are frantic, pacing, weeping, pleading, but the atmosphere inside the house felt different, controlled, organized, almost staged. The ransom note, the infamous 3-page letter written in dramatic, movie-like language, lay on the staircase. But calling it a ransom note barely captures the strangeness of what investigators found. It was long, too long, extensive, filled with oddly specific demands and theatrical phrasing. It read like a script, not a message left in panic by a kidnapper. And then there was the handwriting, looping, deliberate, suspiciously neat in some lines and erratic in others. A forensic expert later described it as having the voice of someone trying to sound dangerous, not someone who actually was. Even more concerning, the amount of time it would take to write such a letter, quietly, in the house, without waking anyone. Investigators at the scene exchanged concerned glances, whispering their confusion. But because JonBené was reported as missing, and because the note insisted the family not contact the police, officers initially handled the case as a kidnapping. This was the first major misstep, one that would haunt the investigation for decades. The home should have been sealed, secured, everyone removed, evidence preserved. But instead, people came and went freely. Friends entered the house to comfort Patsy. Ministers arrived. Neighbors walked through various rooms. Some made coffee in the kitchen. Others sat in the living room, touching surfaces, moving objects, unknowingly contaminating the scene. One officer later said, "It was one of the most compromised crime scenes I had ever witnessed." But why did this happen? Why was protocol ignored? Because Boulder wasn't a city accustomed to violent crime. Officers knew the Ramseys. They were respected, connected. They weren't treated like suspects. They were treated like victims from the moment the call came in. That small-town familiarity, those invisible power structures, allowed chaos to seep into an investigation that required precision from the very first minute. And then there was the behavior within the home. Patsy was distraught, visibly shaking. John remained oddly composed, at times quiet, at times overly helpful, moving around the house despite being told to stay put. Burke, the 9-year-old boy, was reportedly kept away from the officers, upstairs, hidden from view, a detail that still raises questions today. Small behaviors, small gestures, but each one mattered. Around mid-morning, Detective Linda Arndt arrived on the scene. She later said the atmosphere felt wrong from the moment she stepped through the door. There was too much noise, too many people, and too few signs of a genuine kidnapping. By late morning, hours had passed with no word from the supposed kidnappers. No phone call, no confirmation of JonBenét's location, no proof of life. And that's when Arndt made a quiet decision, one that contradicted the standing assumption of a kidnapping. She asked John and a friend to search the house, not for clues, but for the body she feared was already inside. What happened next became one of the most controversial moments in American true crime history. John walked straight to the basement, to a specific room, a windowless space investigators hadn't checked thoroughly, and within seconds, he emerged carrying the lifeless body of JonBené in his arms. He didn't shout for officers. He didn't freeze. He didn't step back in shock. He picked her up, held her, cradled her, and brought her upstairs, contaminating every piece of evidence that could have told investigators what truly happened in that basement. The moment was heartbreaking, but it was also chilling, because instead of answers, this discovery only raised more questions. Questions that would divide detectives, fracture the town, and expose the first cracks in what should have been a straightforward investigation. The basement of the Ramsey home was cold, silent, a place that felt disconnected from the warmth of the holiday decorations upstairs, as if it belonged to a different house entirely. And in that silence, investigators believed the truth of what happened to JonBené was hidden, waiting to be uncovered. But the discovery was already compromised. When John brought JonBené upstairs, her small body wrapped in a blanket, the scene changed from potential evidence to a swirl of emotion, chaos, and irreversible mistakes. Her body had been moved. Her hands had been touched. Fiber transfer became unavoidable. Crime scene integrity, already weak, collapsed entirely. Detective Linda Arndt watched the moment unfold. She later said she knew instantly that they were no longer tracking a kidnapping. This was a homicide inside the house, inside a basement room so neglected that even the officers on scene had barely looked inside. But what she saw next disturbed her more. JonBené's body showed clear signs of trauma. There was a deep ligature mark around her neck, a grotesque indentation that spiraled into a knot, a garrote fashioned from a broken paintbrush, a tool improvised with an unsettling level of intention. Her wrists showed signs of being bound at some point, though the bindings were no longer present. There were marks that suggested struggle, but also an eerie absence of noise. No one in the house reported hearing anything unusual that night. And then, there was the blow to her head. Severe, devastating. A fracture so significant that experts later said it would have caused immediate or near-immediate unconsciousness. The basement told a story, but a fractured one. No clear indication of forced entry. No footprints in the snow outside the house, despite the weather being fresh and soft that entire night. No signs of anyone having come in or out. Just a broken window, and a suitcase placed strangely beneath it. A detail dismissed. Until later. The room where JonBené was found was a storage space. Cluttered, dimly lit. A place rarely used by the family. Her blanket suggested she had been moved there, placed, positioned, not left where the attack began. But as investigators examined the room more closely, something became clear. Whoever placed her there knew the layout of the basement, knew the blind corners, knew which room could hide a body for hours without detection. That detail haunted detectives. But the confusion inside the house was only beginning, because as forensic teams attempted to regain control of the scene, an unsettling pattern emerged. Disagreements between departments, conflicting priorities, and a growing divide that would soon lead to two opposing theories about the crime. Boulder police wanted to consider every possibility, but privately, many officers admitted they were suspicious of the family from the beginning, their behavior, their inconsistencies, their control of the narrative. But the district attorney's office, influenced by Boulder's political dynamics and the Ramseys' social status, pushed for a different angle. They emphasized the possibility of an intruder, a mysterious outsider, a boogeyman who slipped undetected into a $1 million home on a snowy night and vanished without leaving a single reliable trace. Behind closed doors, tensions escalated. Detectives argued over evidence handling. Supervisors clashed about whether the Ramseys should be treated as witnesses or suspects. Some officers later admitted they felt pressure, not spoken but implied, to avoid confronting the family too aggressively. And while investigators fought among themselves, the public narrative spun out of control. The ransom note, bizarre, lengthy, theatrical, became a central point of debate. Some experts said it looked like the work of someone role-playing a kidnapper, using movie language and exaggerated threats. Others argued it was too long, too calm, too carefully written to be a real ransom demands drafted under stress. But the strangest detail was this. The pad it was written on came from the Ramsey house. So did the pen, meaning the note wasn't brought in. It was written inside by someone who felt comfortable enough or confident enough to take their time. Investigators attempted to determine how long the note would take to write. Estimates ranged from 20 minutes to an hour, An hour of sitting quietly in the Ramsey home. An hour of writing uninterrupted. An hour without anyone waking up. But if someone was awake, they weren't talking. Meanwhile, the small-town culture of Boulder began to play a powerful role in the unfolding tragedy. Neighbors whispered theories behind closed doors. Some pointed fingers at drifters or strangers. Others blamed the pageant world. A few dared to question the family, but rarely out loud, because in Boulder, everyone knew the Ramseys, or at least, they thought they did, and as detectives struggled to regain control of the investigation, one question lingered in the air. A question that would soon fracture the community and fuel decades of debate. Was this the work of an unknown intruder, or of someone inside the house? Before anyone could answer, the media arrived, and with them came a storm that no one, not Boulder, not the investigators, not even the Ramseys, was prepared to face. What happened next would change the course of the investigation forever and destroy any chance of a clean, uncontaminated search for the truth. By the afternoon of December 26th, word of the tragedy had already begun to spread across Boulder, but the story would not remain local for long. Within hours, the media descended on the quiet town like a winter storm, filling the streets with satellite vans, reporters, and cameras. A small community built on privacy and quiet routine suddenly found itself thrust into the harsh spotlight of national attention. And almost immediately, the narrative began to split. Some news outlets suggested a mysterious intruder, someone lurking in the shadows, slipping silently into the Ramsey home. Others implied, more cautiously at first, that the answers might lie inside the house itself. The pressure on investigators escalated drastically. Detectives were now racing not only against time, but against a tsunami of speculation and public scrutiny. Every misstep, every delay, every unanswered question became fuel for a growing fire of suspicion. But even as the media frenzy intensified, the Boulder Police Department remained deeply divided. On one side were the officers who believed the crime scene told a simple, disturbing truth. There was no evidence of a break-in, no reliable signs of an intruder, no footprints in the snow, no foreign DNA linking an outsider to the crime. On the other side were officials in the district attorney's office, who insisted that the Ramseys, a prominent and well-connected family, should be treated with caution and respect. They argued that no accusations should be made without undeniable proof. That internal conflict slowed everything. Critical hours passed, then days, then weeks, and each delay allowed evidence to fade, memories to blur, and public speculation to swell into something unmanageable. Yet despite the chaos, forensic teams were uncovering details, small, technical, unsettling details, that would shape the early theories of the case. One of the most important discoveries emerged from an analysis of the ransom note. Experts noticed that certain phrases, "Don't try to grow a brain," "We respect your business but not the country you serve," and the elaborate explanation of the ransom amount seemed eerily similar to lines from popular movies, particularly crime thrillers from the early 90s. This raised a disturbing possibility. Was the note written by someone impersonating a kidnapper, drawing inspiration from fiction? Handwriting analysts were brought in. Their conclusion was not definitive but deeply troubling. The handwriting showed characteristics consistent with Patsy Ramsey, yet not enough to declare a match. It was similar, but not identical. Familiar, but inconclusive. Another layer of confusion. But the most critical forensic detail was the DNA evidence found on JonBenét's clothing, a partial male profile. It was incomplete, degraded, and subject to contamination. Some experts believed it could have been transferred through manufacturing or laundry. Others insisted it might point to an unknown assailant. The debate would rage for decades. As forensic debates unfolded, investigators began analyzing the behavior of everyone inside the house. John's decision to carry JonBené upstairs, instead of calling for detectives, became a central point of suspicion. Why bring her body into the busiest part of the home? Why place her on the carpet? Why wrap her in a blanket? Every action he took erased potential forensic clues. And then there was Patsy. Her reactions that morning were described as dramatic, almost theatrical. She moved between hysteria and composure with surprising speed, at times crying loudly in front of officers, at other times whispering to friends in the kitchen. Investigators noted another detail. She never changed out of the clothes she wore the night before. The same outfit, makeup still applied, hair still done. Was it panic, exhaustion, or something else? Burke, meanwhile, was kept out of sight. His interviews raised even more questions. His emotional responses, his tone, the way he described the morning. Some experts later argued that his behavior was atypical for a child in distress, but none of these observations amounted to proof, only questions. And the town of Boulder, a place built on predictability, didn't know how to handle questions that had no clear answers. Then came the media explosion. Talk shows dissected every detail. National news anchors recreated the timeline hour by hour. Tabloids published outrageous, sensational theories. Several reporters staked out the Ramsey home for weeks, capturing every movement, every statement, every facial expression. Small-town gossip intertwined with national speculation. Neighbors who once exchanged holiday cookies now traded, whispered theories at local coffee shops. Some blamed the family, others blamed an unknown predator. Church members divided. Schools buzzed with rumors. Parents kept children closer than ever. The town, once peaceful, polite, and quiet, transformed into a community consumed by fear, suspicion, and a painful need for answers. And beneath the noise, the investigation suffered. Detectives wasted precious time debunking false tips. Outlandish theories distracted from factual evidence. Political pressure forced the case into the hands of competing authorities, each with different priorities. The foundation of the investigation was cracking, and with every passing day, the truth grew harder to reach. But through the chaos, a pattern was slowly emerging, one that few recognized at the time. The clues that truly mattered weren't the loud, dramatic ones, but the quiet, simple details buried in the final 24 hours. Details that investigators had overlooked in the first rush of panic. Details that would later become critical to understanding what really happened that night. And as those details resurfaced, they would point toward two troubling possibilities. One inside the house and one far darker than anyone expected. As the investigation unfolded, the case began to split into two dominant theories, two narratives that would drag Boulder, the investigators, and the entire country into a polarized debate that still persists today. On one side stood the intruder theory, a mysterious outsider slipping silently into the Ramsey home that night, committing the crime and escaping without leaving meaningful evidence. On the other side was the family theory, the belief that something happened inside that house, a tragic event or a deliberate act, and the Ramseys constructed a story to shield themselves or one another. The tension between these theories didn't just divide investigators. It reshaped the entire trajectory of the case. At first glance, it seemed almost impossible. No footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry, no reliable security footage from nearby homes. And yet, some details suggested an outsider might have been involved. The broken basement window, the one John later claimed he had broken months earlier, became a point of conflict. Some officers insisted it looked recently tampered with. Others found cobwebs undisturbed, suggesting no one climbed through it. Then there was the partial DNA profile found on JonBenét's clothing, degraded but present. Was it from an assailant? Or could it have been transferred during manufacturing, packaging, or handling? Experts disagreed fiercely. There were also strange reports from neighbors. A man spotted wandering in the area weeks before the crime. An unknown vehicle parked near the Ramsey property late at night. A mysterious figure seen near the backyard earlier that week. None of these leads produced a confirmed suspect, but they fueled the idea that a predator had entered the home. And yet, the biggest obstacle was time. How could an intruder have entered a bustling, decorated home, found JonBenét, spent enough time with her to leave the evidence found, wrote a 3-page ransom note, and escaped without waking anyone? That question remained unanswered. This theory emerged not from malice, but from behavioral analysis, contradictions, and small cracks in the story. Investigators noted the unusual calmness John displayed that morning, the way he moved through the house, the decisions he made, the speed with which he found JonBenét's body in a part of the basement no one else seemed to consider relevant. Patsy's behavior was analyzed even more intensely. Her voice during the 911 call, her refusal to remain seated, the dramatic swings between hysteria and control, her insistence on calling friends and clergy before police procedures were complete. The ransom note was another crucial element. It was written on Patsy's notepad, with her pen, inside her home, using phrasing eerily similar to her known writing style, though never conclusively linked. Experts debated for years. Was the note a staged cover-up, a rushed attempt to redirect suspicion, or a panicked act written under emotional duress? Then came the interviews. John and Patsy were cooperative at first, but soon hired lawyers. They declined further questioning until months later. Burke's interviews were analyzed frame by frame, his tone, his facial expressions, his casual recounting of the morning. Some experts argued he was simply a child in shock. Others believed he displayed signs of emotional detachment inconsistent with trauma, and yet none of these behaviors amounted to direct evidence. Suspicion isn't proof. Doubt isn't guilt. Still, the small-town officers believed the answers lay inside that house, but the district attorney's office saw it differently. They supported the intruder angle, and they had the power to overrule key investigative decisions. This internal tug-of-war created chaos. Files were withheld. Leads were pursued unevenly. Suspects in one theory were prioritized, while suspects in the other were ignored. Critical evidence was left unprocessed for months. Those early fractures widened into a chasm. By January, investigators were conducting formal interviews, but each session only deepened the divide. John appeared strategic, measured, and careful with his words. Patsy was emotional but defensive. Burke's responses were disjointed, echoing the confusion of a child who didn't fully grasp what had happened. But it wasn't only the family's behavior that complicated the case. It was the investigators themselves. Detectives disagreed over timelines, disagreed over the interpretation of evidence, disagreed over whether the Ramseys were victims or suspects. Some meetings reportedly ended with shouting. Others ended with silence, the kind that signaled the investigation was losing direction. Psychologists later weighed in. They studied the interviews, facial expressions, and speech patterns. Some claimed the family displayed classic signs of guarded behavior. Others argued these reactions were consistent with grief, shock, and trauma. The deeper they looked, the cloudier the picture became. Meanwhile, small-town Boulder was unraveling. Neighbors whispered theories in grocery store aisles. Friends who once trusted the Ramseys now kept their distance. Church members divided into quiet factions. Parents supervised their children more closely than ever before. A community that valued harmony found itself drowning in distrust. Every conversation became a debate. Every friendship strained. Fear, grief, suspicion. They hung in the air like the winter fog that lingered over Boulder's streets. But amid the confusion, something else was happening. Something that went unnoticed at first. Several investigators began re-examining the family's final day. The subtle shifts in routine, the emotional cracks, the strange calm that hung over the house that morning. And as they looked closer, they found overlooked details. Details that didn't match the intruder theory or the official family narrative. Small inconsistencies, quiet deviations, moments of silence that carried weight. Moments that, when placed together, painted a very different picture of those final hours. And those details would soon lead investigators back into the basement, not physically but psychologically, to re-examine the one room that held more truth than anyone wanted to admit. In the months that followed, investigators began circling back to the same question again and again. What really happened inside the Ramsey home during those final 24 hours? Not the public narrative, not the media speculation, but the quiet, subtle details that most people overlooked. The details that didn't make headlines, but unsettled the detectives who studied the case the longest. It was during this reevaluation that the true fracture in the timeline began to emerge. Because when investigators pieced together the behavior of each family member, hour by hour, conversation by conversation, they discovered patterns that didn't fit neatly into either theory. Not entirely intruder, not entirely family, something in between, something more human, more emotional, more flawed. The official story suggested a peaceful Christmas evening, family, festivities, a tired child placed in bed. But when investigators re-examined witness accounts, phone records, and behavior patterns, they noticed discrepancies. Patsy claimed the night was calm, yet multiple friends had observed tension earlier that day. Subtle friction between family members. Moments of strain that seemed to pass unnoticed at the time. A neighbor reported hearing a sharp metallic sound, sometime around midnight. Something that stood out in Boulder's winter quiet. It was dismissed initially, but returned as a point of interest when investigators analyzed the homemade garrote found in the basement. Another detail resurfaced, a bowl of pineapple left on the kitchen table. JonBenét's fingerprints were on it. Burke's fingerprints were on it. Patsy insisted JonBené was asleep when they got home, but the pineapple suggested she was awake, at least for a moment. It wasn't forensic proof, but it was a break in routine. A tiny fracture that created room for chaos. Investigators began to wonder, did something happen after they returned home? A moment of frustration, an accident, a confrontation, something that spiraled in the way tragedies often do, quickly, unexpectedly, irreversibly, and would a family in shock, or in fear, behave rationally afterward? Or would they react emotionally, impulsively, making flawed decisions that obscured the truth unintentionally? These questions took investigators back into the basement, not physically but mentally, into a space that represented the darkest possibilities of that night. By reanalyzing the crime scene photographs, investigators noticed something unsettling about the basement layout. The room where JonBené was found wasn't a natural choice for any intruder. It was deep within the basement, past storage boxes, past cluttered space, past areas rarely visited. To reach it required familiarity, comfort, confidence navigating that labyrinth in the dark. This raised a haunting implication. The offender wasn't lost. They knew exactly where they were going. The suitcase beneath the window became another point of contention. Was it placed there to climb out, or placed there after the fact in a misguided attempt to stage a scene? The latter seemed more likely upon closer inspection. Not professional, not precise, not the work of a calculating predator, but of someone improvising in panic. And then there was the garrote. Crude, improvised but assembled with intention. A tool that suggested knowledge of control, or a desperate attempt to stage the crime as something darker, more deliberate, more external. The psychological implications of the basement were overwhelming. Whoever committed the act, or staged it, operated with familiarity, not fear of discovery. They moved with purpose, not haste. They took time, and that simple fact contradicted the idea of an intruder fleeing into the night. The DNA profile found years later renewed public interest in the intruder theory, but forensic experts quietly reminded the public that touch DNA can travel from manufacturing plants, from laundry handling, from any number of innocent sources. It wasn't proof, it was a possibility. The ransom note, however, continued to stand out as the loudest piece of evidence in the case, but not for the reasons most people think. Its length, its bizarre tone, the handwriting inconsistencies, the movie-inspired phrases. It wasn't the letter of a professional, nor the letter of someone in a rush. It was theatrical, self-aware, almost performative. Investigators noticed something chilling in the reanalysis. The note wasn't simply a misdirection. It reflected the psychology of the writer, someone trying desperately to sound like someone they weren't. Whoever wrote it wasn't trying to ask for ransom. They were trying to create a story that would explain noise, explain panic, explain trauma, explain a night that spiraled out of control, a story that would point away from the house. And then came the one detail that investigators struggled to reconcile with any intruder theory. Why was JonBenét's body still inside the home? Predators don't leave victims behind in accessible rooms. They flee, they hide, they distance themselves instantly. But here, in this case, the body was placed, covered, arranged, almost as if the offender couldn't leave the house, or didn't want to. This detail became the emotional heart of the investigation. Not proof, but a psychological truth. Someone stayed long enough to process what happened, to write, to think, to move, to stage. Someone who wasn't afraid of being in that house, someone who belonged there. By mid-1997, both sides, intruder and family, had built strong cases. Both had logic, both had flaws, both were incomplete. Detectives reached what they later called the point of collapse, the moment where evidence and emotion collided so violently that the case could no longer be seen from a single perspective. They needed a breakthrough, a confession, a forensic revelation, something undeniable. But Boulder wasn't going to get one. Instead, what they got was the truth that investigators feared most. The case wasn't just unsolved, it was becoming unsolvable. So many mistakes, so much contamination, so many competing narratives, so many human failures. And yet beneath all of this, the behavior of the people inside the house, their movements, their emotional responses, their choices, continued to whisper the same quiet truth. Everything that mattered happened before sunrise. Everything that mattered was in the final 24 hours. And the clues everyone ignored, the breaks in routine, the strange behaviors, the subtle tension, were now impossible to overlook. But the consequences of those overlooked clues would echo far beyond the Ramsey home, shaking Boulder, the investigators, and the entire country for years to come. As 1997 unfolded, the JonBenét Ramsey case shifted from an active investigation to something far more fractured, a collision of politics, ego, emotion, and public pressure. What should have been a unified search for truth slowly became a tug-of-war between competing agendas, each pulling the case in a different direction until the original timeline, the one that mattered most, was buried beneath noise. The Boulder Police Department, frustrated and undermined, believed the answers lay inside the Ramsey home. The district attorney's office, cautious and protective, insisted that the family was being unfairly scrutinized. And the media amplified every disagreement, turning speculation into spectacle and doubt into headlines. In small-town America, where reputations last decades, not days, the consequences were immediate. Neighbors no longer trusted each other's stories. Childhood friendships dissolved. Whispers replaced conversations. A quiet community that once felt insulated from tragedy now lived under a shadow, one they couldn't escape and couldn't fully understand. And beneath all of it was the feeling that someone knew more than they were saying. Behind closed doors, investigators pushed forward with renewed analysis. They reviewed every report, every photograph, every interview, every contradictory statement. And as they re-examined the case, several patterns emerged, not of guilt, but of human imperfection. Critical notes were misplaced. Evidence logs were inconsistent. Entire sections of the house had been overlooked on the first day. Officers later admitted they weren't prepared for a crime of this magnitude. It wasn't incompetence, it wasn't conspiracy. It was small-town policing faced with a nightmare scenario. Even so, several oversight failures became impossible to ignore. The basement wasn't cleared thoroughly when officers first arrived. Friends and clergy were allowed into the home before the scene was secured. The ransom note was handled improperly. John's discovery of the body wasn't supervised. Fingerprints and fibers were compromised by constant movement through the house. Each mistake widened the gap between what happened and what could be proven. And with each passing week, the truth became more distant. Talk shows invited handwriting experts, psychologists, criminal profilers, and child pageant critics. Tabloids published sensational stories. National networks replayed the same clips of the Ramsey family over and over, their interviews dissected frame by frame, every gesture interpreted as truth or deception. Theories exploded into the public consciousness. A jealous competitor in the pageant world, a disturbed neighborhood intruder, a family argument turned tragic, a cover-up staged through the ransom note, a sexual predator hiding in Boulder, a botched kidnapping. Each theory came with its own followers, its own believers, its own experts. In Boulder, this led to a strange cultural shift. People began choosing sides, aligning themselves with one narrative or another, as if the case were a courtroom drama instead of a real tragedy. The community's emotional landscape fractured. Parents feared for their children. Teachers quietly debated theories in break rooms. Coffee shops turned into hubs of speculation. The fear wasn't just about JonBenét's killer. It was about the unsettling realization that the truth could be lost, swallowed by chaos. As the pressure mounted, everyone involved began to show signs of strain. Investigators worked long hours, revisiting leads that had gone cold, sometimes questioning whether they could ever untangle the mess. The psychological weight of the case was enormous, and it showed. Detectives described sleepless nights, stress-induced illnesses, and an overwhelming fear of missing the one detail that could bring clarity. Others admitted privately that they felt powerless as political forces overshadowed their work. Meanwhile, the Ramsey family lived under a microscope of national scrutiny. Friends distanced themselves. Neighbors avoided eye contact in grocery stores. Reporters camped outside their home, waiting for any expression to interpret, any gesture to turn into a headline. John and Patsy, already grieving, found themselves fighting a battle on two fronts: the loss of their daughter and the loss of their reputation. Burke, the child at the center of the storm, became both shielded and scrutinized. Psychologists later noted that the emotional aftermath of such intense public attention would likely follow him for life. The consequences didn't end there. Small-town Boulder, once unified, progressive, and proud, became a place defined by fear and doubt. Home security systems skyrocketed. Parents kept children indoors. Holiday gatherings grew quieter. Trust fractured. A crime that should have brought the community together had done the opposite. By late 1997, both major theories had glaring holes. The intruder theory struggled with lack of forced entry, absence of tracks, and the psychological implausibility of an offender writing a long ransom note inside the home. The family theory struggled with lack of concrete evidence, no reliable confession, no eyewitnesses, no unambiguous forensic links, and yet both theories persisted, fueled by emotion, perspective, and the imperfect nature of human memory. Cold case experts later pointed out something that investigators at the time struggled to articulate. The case wasn't just about evidence. It was about behavior, about routine, about the psychological ripples surrounding the final hours before dawn. But by the time investigators reached this realization, the damage was irreversible. The case files had grown to thousands of pages. Evidence had deteriorated. Witness memories had faded. Political tensions had reached a boiling point. The case wasn't dead, but it wasn't alive either. It existed in a limbo, an unresolved narrative wrapped in layers of fear, speculation, and human error. And still, beneath all the noise, one haunting truth lingered. The key to the case remained in the small cracks of behavior, the overlooked moments, the ignored clues, the subtle shifts in the final hours of December 25th, details that had always been there, hidden beneath the weight of public expectation and investigative chaos. And in the years that followed, those details would return, resurfacing in re-examinations, documentaries, and private investigations, each one pointing in the same direction, toward a truth that remained painfully out of reach. Years passed, but the shadow of JonBenét Ramsey never lifted from Boulder. People moved houses, children grew up, businesses opened and closed, but the case remained, fixed in the town's collective memory like a ghost that refused to fade. A constant reminder that even the quietest towns can harbor nightmares that time cannot erase. As the late 1990s turned into the early 2000s, investigators, journalists, and criminal profilers revisited the case again and again, each time hoping that a new perspective, a fresh set of eyes, or an advancement in forensic science might break the stalemate. But instead of clarity, what emerged was a maze, deeper, darker, and more complicated than before. Colorado's legal landscape changed, bringing new investigators and new priorities. Cold case specialists from outside the county reviewed evidence with a level of detachment that wasn't possible in 1996. Their conclusion wasn't comforting. Almost everything about the case and the scene, the interviews, the timelines, the evidence, had been compromised by the chaotic first 24 hours. Still, they pushed forward. Advances in DNA technology prompted several rounds of retesting. A partial profile was detected on JonBenét's clothing, but it was incomplete, easily explained by secondary transfer, and too degraded to identify a suspect. This fragment of DNA became the centerpiece of the intruder theory for years, despite experts warning that it wasn't definitive. The ransom note underwent new linguistic and forensic analysis. Experts compared phrasing, pressure points in handwriting, and syntactic tendencies. Some analysts still saw strong similarities to Patsy's writing style. Others called the letter a deliberate attempt to mimic someone else, perhaps sloppily, perhaps with emotional distress guiding the hand. The contradictions persisted. Every new round of testing seemed to generate more questions than answers. While investigators struggled with scientific uncertainty, Boulder struggled with something far more emotional, the burden of unresolved tragedy. For years, conversations about JonBenét hovered in every cafe, every school, every neighborhood gathering. Parents who once trusted the safety of their community now found themselves checking locks twice. Children raised during the investigation learned her name before they understood the story, and those who lived near the Ramsey home experienced a strange kind of collective guilt, an unspoken weight of having been so close to something so horrific. Small-town psychology played a powerful role here. Boulder had never been prepared for a crime of this magnitude. The town's culture, intellectual, peaceful, insulated, didn't know how to process a tragedy with no resolution. Many residents began embracing one of the two major theories not because of evidence, but because of emotional comfort. Believing in an intruder provided distance, a villain from outside, an evil that came and went. Believing in the family theory provided closure, a self-contained explanation, tragic but confined. Neither perspective was based purely on fact. Both were shaped by fear. Meanwhile, the Ramseys endured public scrutiny on a level rarely seen in American crime history. They defended themselves in interviews, filed lawsuits against tabloids, and repeatedly begged for the public to look beyond the headlines. But even innocence cannot erase suspicion. The weight of public judgment was relentless. In the mid-2000s, new investigators re-examined the case with modern forensic tools. They revisited the basement, the garrote, the ligature marks, the handwriting, the window, the pineapple, the bowl, the timeline. Each clue seemed to point in two directions at once, but one theme emerged repeatedly: the psychology of the final 24 hours. Experts began to focus on behavior. Why did JonBené show signs of fatigue that day? Why did neighbors notice odd sounds that night? Why was the pineapple left out? Why did Patsy remain in the same clothes from the night before? Why was John so quick to search the basement? Why did the ransom note sound like a performance rather than a threat? Piece by piece, the psychological reconstruction became clearer than the physical evidence. Not a confession, not a revelation, but a pattern. Something shifted inside that house before dawn. Something emotional, something human, something that caused the timeline to break in ways too subtle for early investigators to catch. And then there was the biggest contradiction of all, the one detail modern profilers kept returning to. If an intruder committed the crime, why did they remain in the house long enough to write a 3-page note? Why didn't they flee immediately? Why stage anything? Predators behave one way, panic behaves another, fear behaves another. The basement, the note, the staging, none of it aligned with the psychology of a fleeing intruder. It aligned with the psychology of someone who wasn't fleeing, someone who stayed, someone who knew the house, someone who needed to create a story. But even this wasn't proof, just a chilling, persistent echo of the final night. 20 years later, Boulder still debates the case in quiet corners of coffee shops, at neighborhood gatherings, and in living rooms during late-night conversations. Some residents refuse to talk about it, the pain and uncertainty too heavy. Others follow every documentary, every new theory, every announcement of potential testing. The case became more than a crime. It became part of Boulder's identity, etched into the town's history as permanently as the mountains that surround it. Generations changed. Investigators retired. New detectives inherited the files. But one thing remained constant. Everyone still returns to those final 24 hours, to the small details, the subtle shifts, the breaks in routine, the clues that were overlooked. Because somewhere in that single day, that holiday, that night, that basement, the truth still waits. And in the final chapter of this story, the impact of that truth, or the lack of it, will reveal how this case reshaped everyone it touched, and why some mysteries refuse to die. Time has a way of softening memories, but not this one, not in Boulder, not for the investigators who lived with the case, not for the Ramsey family, and not for the millions of people around the world who still search for answers in a story defined as much by what we don't know as by what we do. 3 decades later, the JonBenét Ramsey case remains one of the most haunting unresolved crimes in American history, not because it lacks evidence, but because the evidence was swallowed by confusion, emotion, and the fragile nature of human decision-making. And beneath all the theories, all the headlines, all the documentaries and debates, one truth has become undeniable. The final 24 hours hold the key. Not the loud details, not the sensational ones, but the quiet, overlooked moments that slipped through the cracks in the early hours of December 26th. For the investigators, the case became a weight they carried for years. Some described it as a wound that never closed. Others admitted privately that they replayed those first hours over and over, imagining what they might have done differently. For Boulder, the crime left a permanent scar on the town's psyche. A community once defined by stability and serenity found itself forever linked to tragedy. Parents raised children under a different kind of vigilance. New families who moved in felt the story lingering in the air, even if they hadn't lived through it. And for the Ramseys, the emotional toll was immeasurable. Grief intertwined with suspicion. Public judgment collided with private pain. Their lives became a mosaic of lawsuits, interviews, denials, and attempts at healing that never fully succeeded. Patsy passed away in 2006. Still insisting on her family's innocence. John remarried and stepped away from the spotlight, though the ghost of the case followed him. Burke grew into adulthood under the weight of a story he never chose, analyzed, criticized, and discussed by strangers across the world. No matter the theory, no matter the belief, one reality stands firm. Every person touched by this case paid a price. In later years, law enforcement agencies revisited the case multiple times. Advances in DNA testing brought momentary hope. New technology, new tools, new possibilities, but no definitive answers. Independent investigators studied the ransom note with modern linguistic software. Some saw deception, others saw desperation. All saw inconsistency. Cold case experts reanalyzed the basement layout. Professors in criminology restructured the timeline. Behavioral analysts revisited the interviews, emphasizing micro-expressions, pauses, and word choices. Each new perspective added layers, but none unraveled the heart of the mystery. The case remained suspended, hauntingly unresolved, tantalizingly close to clarity, yet always just out of reach. Modern profilers often say that the truth of a crime lies not in the most dramatic details, but in the smallest ones. And when we strip away speculation, emotion, and hindsight, what remains are the quiet truths hidden in that final day. The unusual fatigue JonBené showed, the tension among family members earlier that afternoon, the strange sounds reported by neighbors, the bowl of pineapple waiting on the table, the handwritten note composed inside the house, the arrangement of the basement, the familiarity required to navigate it, the lack of forced entry, the absence of footprints in the snow, the timing that made an intruder nearly impossible. None of these details prove what happened, but together, they form a psychological map of chaos, emotion, and human imperfection, a map that suggests this crime wasn't the work of a shadowy invader, nor the work of a hardened criminal, but something more tragic, more intimate, more human. And that possibility, that the truth might be painfully simple, has become the most difficult realization for those who studied the case for decades, not because the truth is hidden, but because it may have always been there in plain sight. Today, the Ramsey home stands as a landmark of unresolved fear and unanswered questions. People pass by it quietly, visitors take photos from a distance, locals avoid discussing it. Teachers still remind students that this was once a real tragedy, not just a story for television. The legacy isn't just the crime, it's the reminder that even the safest communities can harbor fractures beneath their polished surfaces. That tragedy can emerge from routine, that human decisions, good and bad, shape the course of justice. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, some mysteries don't fade because they're unsolvable. They fade because they depend on someone choosing to speak. In the end, the JonBené Ramsey case remains an echo, a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly certainty dissolves, and how the moments we overlook can be the ones that matter most. Boulder has changed, the investigators have changed, the Ramseys have changed, the world has changed, but the final 24 hours, the quiet, fragile, overlooked moments, still hold the weight of everything that happened. And until the truth surfaces, the case will remain exactly where it has always been, on the edge of revelation, shrouded in mystery, held hostage by silence. If you want to follow more hidden crimes from quiet American towns, tragedies that unfold where no one expects them, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us for the next story, waiting in the shadows of quiet town crimes. Thank you for watching. And remember, even the quietest places have secrets.